It was a quiet night as 28-year-old police corporal Sergio Pucheta rode his Honda motorcycle down a dirt road near General Pico, Argentina. It was pitch dark out, with no road lights and heavy clouds overhead. The road was lit only by his motorcycle's headlight. The rich farmland of the La Pampa area passed on either side as he traveled down the dirt road. Sergio was watching for poachers who often came out here at night to trap wild cats, monkeys, and birds that they regularly sold for parts for cash on the black market. At around 10 p.m., Sergio approached the intersection called El Cruce de las Cañas. Up ahead, he saw the red tail lights of a car. At first, it appeared just like the car was coming to a halt, but at that point, it turned off the road and drove into a cluster of trees and thick vegetation. Suddenly, the lights disappeared. Sergio felt his heart begin to beat faster. He knew this had to be a poacher, and he may have spotted him. They must have realized he might be a police officer, so they drove off the road, attempting to hide from Sergio. And when he reached the spot where the car had left the road, he pulled over and stopped. Sergio climbed off his motorcycle and radioed into the General Pico station, asking for reinforcements. He knew it would be some time until backup showed up, so he unholstered his weapon. He was determined to find the poachers and not let them escape. Sergio pulled out his flashlight and showed it on the side of the road. Confused, he noticed that none of the vegetation or brush had been disturbed. It looked uniform and untouched. With his weapon drawn before him, he started walking up the side of the road, looking for some evidence of the car. But there was nothing. No tire tracks. Nothing. He was perplexed. He was sure that the poachers had driven through the brush and into the trees a short distance away. He stopped and listened for the sound of a car engine, but the only thing he heard was the sound of crickets and cicadas, the hoots of owls, and the chirping of the native birds. Sergio knew he needed to capture these poachers, and he would have to find them. He took a deep breath and entered the dark. He walked quickly through the brush, careful not to make a sound. His weapon was ready, and he looked for any sign of the criminals. He reached the trees, and about 100 feet in, he saw a red glow from the corner of his eye. For a moment, it looked like moonlight reflecting off something metal, but it was a cloudy night. He believed it must be the car. "I caught them," he thought. When he turned toward the object, he realized it was no car. What he saw was so frightening that he stopped in his tracks. The sounds of wildlife started to increase all around him. He felt his panic grow inside his chest. He needed to scream, but when he opened his mouth, nothing came out. Sometime later, an off-duty police officer, who was a friend of Sergio's, was heading to bed when his phone rang. He looked at the screen and saw Sergio calling. He opened his phone and said hello, but Sergio didn't reply. Instead, in a cold, monotone voice, Sergio said to come to his location and his friend would know what to do. Then the line went dead. The officer tried calling Sergio several times but never got a response. He wondered why Sergio was behaving in such a strange manner. The officer felt compelled to call the station. When he spoke to the dispatcher, he was told that Sergio had contacted them and backup was on the way. The dispatcher also said they were very concerned for Sergio and could not contact him. Every effort was met with silence. 3 police cars with other officers sped past the cornfields and wooded areas to where Sergio had last been. When they got there, they found his motorcycle, but Sergio was nowhere to be seen. The 3 cars pulled over and the officers got out. One of the officers attempted to contact Sergio again on the radio. Still, there was silence. They fanned out and pulled out their flashlights. They started looking up and down the road, trying to find any sign of Sergio. About half a mile from the abandoned motorcycle, one of the officers spotted a cluster of what he thought was trash on the side of the road. The officer walked up, shone his light on the pile and gasped. He called the other officers over. The pieces on the ground were connected to Sergio. They were the dismantled parts of Sergio's radio and weapon. Also, lying there was his cell phone. This discovery prompted a more intensive police search as more reinforcements were called in. Once they arrived, they joined in the search. They searched the cornfield and brush for any sign of their comrade. That's when they found what looked like footprints in the ground below, headed away from the road toward a cluster of trees. After getting around 100 feet in, they noticed something strange. With each step, the prints were farther apart, and their stride increased. Initially, they thought Sergio must have started sprinting and taking massive long strides. But as they continued, the steps got farther apart. 10 feet, then 15, and finally 20 feet. Too far for any human, even if running. The officers continued following the prints and looked at each other uneasily. Each impression was clear, and they knew they had not missed any. There was no doubt that they were human. The officers who had been talking with each other before went quiet. They followed Sergio's path for more than a mile until they reached the trees. All of a sudden, they lost the footprints entirely. It was as if Sergio had jumped in the air and vanished. The search continued into the early morning, despite heavy rain that began to come down around 2. But they never gave up. Even after losing the footprints, they continued but never found another trace of Sergio or the poachers he had reported. There were no tire tracks from any vehicle other than Sergio's motorcycle. No broken vegetation or anything resembling a car had ever been driven into the trees. There were no signs of any struggle that could explain why Sergio was gone and why his gun and radio were disassembled by the side of the road. At 4:30 p.m. on March 3rd, 2006, roughly 18 hours after Sergio had disappeared and about 18 miles away, a farmer was walking through his property. The man looked ahead and saw a dark figure sitting by the side of the road. The farmer squinted to get a better look. The figure looked like a man curled into a ball in the mud. The farmer was concerned and thought the man might be injured. He called out but got no response. He continued walking toward the figure. When he got close, he saw that the figure was a man who was a police officer in full uniform. The officer's knees were pulled up to his chest and his arms wrapped around them. His head was buried in his lap. The farmer could not see his face. Strangely, even though it had stopped raining and the ground around the officer was wet, he was completely dry. The farmer leaned over and gently touched the officer's shoulder, asking if he was all right. He got no reaction. The officer just sat unmoving, his head in his lap, not reacting and silent. The farmer found this behavior so concerning that he took out his phone and called the police. As they were close, it took them only a short time to arrive. The officer on the ground was identified as Sergio. Despite their repeated pleas, Sergio wouldn't talk to anyone, not the other officers nor the farmer. He didn't appear to be injured, but there was something wrong. An ambulance was called, and the officers summoned Sergio's supervisor to see if he could get him to respond. When Sergio's supervisor arrived, he was able to coax Sergio off the ground, but still, he wouldn't speak. What he did do, though, was give his supervisor a big hug and broke down crying. His supervisor led Sergio to the ambulance, which had just arrived, and got him in the back. They climbed in together and his supervisor sat with him until they reached the Gobernador Centeno hospital. Once they arrived, he followed him into his exam room. At first, Sergio didn't want anybody to touch him. He was very anxious and kept squinting and grimacing whenever the lights were on him. After a few minutes, he finally let the doctors and nurses remove his clothes and examine his body for wounds. Everyone had expected Sergio to have injuries, thinking he had likely been assaulted or kidnapped. However, as his supervisor watched the doctors and nurses check Sergio out, it was obvious that Sergio had no injuries. There were no bruises, cuts, or signs of any physical struggle. As the nurse took his vitals, it was clear that he was not dehydrated or sick, despite having no food or water for 18 hours. The only injury the medical team could find was to his feet. When they removed his boots and socks, they found strange burns on the soles of his feet. It looked like he'd been standing on a hot surface. Sergio finally began to talk and told a totally wild story. He said that at 10 p.m. he had followed the poachers into the trees. He had been absolutely sure that he had seen the metal of the poacher's car shining through the trees. However, when he looked closer, he didn't see a car and there were no poachers. When he turned to look around, he saw two sets of burning red eyes staring back at him in the darkness. He stood there stunned, unsure what to make of the eyes or who they belonged to. Before he could do anything, the eyes began to move closer. He realized with growing horror that these were not human eyes. They were not animal eyes. They belonged to something he had never seen before. All he could make out beyond the burning red eyes were slim grey bodies with long skinny fingers and a big head. They didn't appear to blink at all. Sergio opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out when he did. That's when he realized that not only could he not scream, but he was frozen in place. He suddenly felt this intense pressure in his chest and back and involuntarily arched in response. It felt like his spine was going to snap. Sergio tried to wrench himself free of whatever seemed to control him. He felt himself start to walk out of the forest backward toward the road, his back still arched in a totally unnatural position. He felt helpless as one of his hands went down and he pulled out his phone. He dialed the number of the officer with whom he was friends. In a detached, cold voice, he told his friend to come get him and that he should know what to do. Sergio continued to walk in this bizarre, bent fashion when he felt himself reach for his gun. After he drew it out, he watched in horror as his hands fully disassembled it and let it drop the pieces on the ground. He then dropped his phone on the ground. Sergio watched himself take apart his radio. These red-eyed creatures were just a few feet away, staring at him the whole time. Only after Sergio had disarmed himself did he feel that intense pressure on him subside. Realizing that this was his chance to escape, he took off running, but after only going a few steps, he felt himself get hit from behind. He fell forward, but he didn't hit the ground. Instead, it was like he was flying up into the sky, and for a moment, he just flew through the air toward the trees until, abruptly, he was let go. He fell to the ground and somehow managed to land on his feet. Then, once again, he was lifted up, and this time, he was thrown even farther before hitting the ground. Then it happened again and again, each time coming closer and closer to the trees. As this happened, Sergio realized these red-eyed creatures must be in control, and they were playing with him. They knew he was trying to escape and kept picking him up and throwing him repeatedly. As all this happened, Sergio began to feel his feet burn. Then the eyes disappeared. He knew that he was alone. The red-eyed creatures were gone. Sergio looked over his shoulder. All he saw were swaying cornstalks in darkness. For a moment, he thought that he was free. But while still running, he turned to look straight ahead and saw that there was an incredible wall of pure darkness. There was no cornfield, ground, sky, moon, or stars, nothing but pure black. He felt himself rise into the air again and looked down into the inky darkness. Into a void that stared back at him were two red glowing eyes. After that, he passed out. Sergio had no idea how he wound up 18 hours later on the side of the road, absolutely frozen in fear, but he did remember sitting there from early morning until the farmer discovered him in the late afternoon. No one has ever been able to explain what happened to Sergio. He was so traumatized that he retired from the police force and continues to undergo psychiatric treatment. Police and locals still report seeing strange lights in and around La Pampa. Watch these videos next.